Tonight, the final debate in the race for Multnomah County District Attorney, from civil unrest to the explosion of fentanyl on our streets. The past 4 years have shown the DA plays a critical role when it comes to some of the biggest challenges we face. Their decisions moving forward will determine who we prosecute for crimes, how we deal with our drug crisis, and will guide how and when we compel and support people to get off the streets and into stable housing. Tonight, we ask about those important topics and many more. From KGW News and The Oregonian, this is the debate for Multnomah County District Attorney.
A very good evening and welcome to the debate in the race for Multnomah County District Attorney. I'm David Molko with KGW News along with our partners at The Oregonian. Thanks for joining us over the next hour, because this year there might be more attention and more at stake when it comes to the race to become the county's top prosecutor. So with that, let's introduce our candidates. Mike Schmidt is the current Multnomah County District Attorney running for his second term. Schmidt was first elected in May 2020 and took office that summer as protests rocked the Rose City. His challenger is Nathan Vasquez, a senior deputy district attorney who became a prosecutor in Multnomah County in 2001. Vasquez has prosecuted a wide range of crimes, including violent felonies such as homicides. Welcome to both of you. Before we begin, though, a few ground rules. For the next hour, you've agreed to answer questions from me and my co-moderator, the Oregonian's Noel Crombie, an investigative journalist who focuses on the criminal justice system. Tonight's questions were crafted by journalists at KGW and The Oregonian, and each question will go to both candidates. We'll also include some questions from our viewers and readers. Candidates, you'll each have 60 seconds to answer. Mr. Vasquez, as the challenger, you will go first for question one, and we will be alternating who speaks first from there on out. Keep in mind there may be brief follow-ups and time for rebuttals as well. And at the end of the hour, we will finish everything off with a lightning round. I'll be watching the time, and Noel will kick us off with the opening question. Noel?
Thank you. Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Vasquez, good evening. This week, we saw peaceful protests on the Portland State University campus devolve into what the Portland police chief called a criminal event, with some demonstrators breaking into, occupying, and damaging the library. This morning, police, at the request of the university, cleared the building and made multiple arrests, including students and outsiders. Broadly speaking, what will your approach be as DA when it comes to holding people accountable who damage property and trespass? Mr. Vasquez, go first.
Thank you. First and foremost, what we need in this particular situation is a DA that you can trust and one with experience. What we've seen clearly is that back in 2020, Mike Schmidt's policy was an absolute failure. It's still, in fact, if you go on the official website for the Multnomah County DA's office, it's still there. If you Google protest policy, it will come up and tell you all of the things that he refused to prosecute and all of the things that he was going to give conditional dismissal to. These things are really all things that are covered and are happening right now at PSU. And sadly, it goes much further, as we've seen those 15 cars that were hit by arson as well. Now, with my experience, what you get is someone who prosecutes in an even-handed manner, who doesn't, as my opponent does, flip-flop in the last second and now has decided it's okay to prosecute. I'm someone that's prosecuted the Proud Boys, I've prosecuted Antifa, and I think tonight's question is to Mike, are you ready to admit that that was a failure in 2020 and come back to an even-handed approach towards prosecuting this political violence?
Mr. Vasquez, that is time.
Thank you. Mr. Schmidt?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, for hosting this debate. I appreciate being here tonight with you. Look, what I've been doing all week has been working closely with the PSU president, with the chief of police, with other law enforcement officers as we have come together, as you saw, in a unified front to be on the same page and announce what our strategies were. By no means are we declaring victory, as we said today at the press conference, but what you can see is that the library was cleared out. I've been very clear that there's no tolerance for property damage or destruction. That's not okay. Those individuals will be prosecuted. I believe there are 22 arrests to date. This is completely different from 2020 when we were in the middle of a pandemic. My opponent likes to gloss over the context of that moment. When our courthouse was ground to a halt, caseloads were at an all-time high, prosecutorial staff was at an all-time low. We had to make decisions about resources. Today, we have the resources we need, the courts are back open, and we're holding people accountable when they commit property damage.
Thank you. And to follow up on the topic of 2020, what specific lessons from your experience that year, what are the lessons that you take from that year, and how will they impact your decisions going forward? Mr. Vasquez, can you limit your response to 30 seconds, please?
Certainly. In 2020, I was actually there the night that protesters lit the Justice Center on fire, and I was there for almost really every night. And I found very quickly that, we needed to be an active participant in this process. And what unfortunately happened is that protest policy sent us in a spiral downhill. And what's glossed over by my opponent is that it sent two clear messages. It told people that wanted to do violence that they had a free get out of jail free card. And sadly, it told police officers that they were not valued in our community.
Thank you. Mr. Schmidt?
Yeah, so my first day in office was August 1st, 2020. That was the 60th day of the protest. So what Mr. Vasquez is describing had already happened underneath my predecessor. When I took over office, we announced that we would focus our resources on those committing property damage and violent crime, and that's what we did. And at my direction, Mr. Vasquez prosecuted those cases. In fact, sometimes it was hard to get him and others to do that, but we had to go in, and I went into his office specifically and demanded that he prosecute Proud Boy Alan Swinney when nothing was happening with that case.
Mr. Vasquez, do you want to respond to that briefly?
I do. That is one of the most ridiculous assertions that my opponent has made. I dedicated weekends, nights, fighting hard for our community. I was the one that was there with police when these things were coming. I was the one that was reviewing search warrants. There was never a moment in time when Mike Schmidt ever appeared in court or ever had to come in any way and tell me what to do. Because my 23 years of experience, to be clear, I know how to prosecute cases. He does not.
All right, Mr. Schmidt, just briefly here.
Well, he didn't actually answer the question at all. He just went back to his talking points about how much experience he has.
Well, let's move on to the next question here, gentlemen. We're talking about law enforcement. What should a healthy relationship look like between your office and a police agency like the Portland Police Bureau? A healthy relationship. Mr. Schmidt, 60 seconds.
Yeah, so, obviously getting started in the protests were a challenging time to take over office when my predecessor quit before his term was up and the chief of police stepped down. But even then, in the midst of all that, I was meeting with the chief of police and his team of officers once a month up in the Portland Police Building and having conversations about what were our strategies, how were we going to work together. We've continued that every single month since I've been district attorney. Obviously, we meet more frequently in other meetings, but that's a time where we just get together to talk about how can we collaborate. And we've had a lot of good products of that collaboration, from starting an auto crime, an auto theft task force, a retail theft task force. I went on a ride along with officers as street racing has been a big problem in our community. And I got to go on a street racing mission, and I saw firsthand the work that they're doing. But one of the things I heard from the commander of the North Precinct was they don't have the resources that they need to do the street racing missions. I went down to the CJC, the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission, got them a $100,000 grant so they can do more of those missions. That's what collaboration and good teamship partnership looks like.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Vasquez, the question is, what should a healthy relationship look like between your office and a police agency? 60 seconds.
Yeah, again, this is one that really revolves around trust. And it's hard to hear Mr. Schmidt talk and have any trust in the words he says, because as we've all seen, he broke that relationship with law enforcement very clearly in 2020 and doubled down at many times throughout his 4 years here. In fact, the chief of police even had to tell the everyday officer, hey, stop going out and tell business owners, victims, and everyday citizens that you would make an arrest. However, the DA's office won't prosecute it. I'm proud to say that in my years of experience, police know that they can count on me to deliver. Now, it is clear from the fact that all first responders in this community have endorsed me. And it's clear that they know that at 2 in the morning, they can call me, just like last night when those when those vehicles were lit on fire, they could call me. I will answer the phone. I will always be there to assist and collaborate, and I will always be there to be the district attorney that can deliver results for our community.
Mr. Schmidt, would you like to respond on the point of trust there?
Yeah, I mean, we've built trust. Mr. Vasquez likes to point out that what the chief of police directed his officers to say. What he was actually doing was correcting misinformation in the community. The same misinformation spread by People for Portland and all the backers that Mr. Vasquez relies on in his campaign. So we have that trust with the chief, and that's why when there was more allegations this week about not prosecuting, the chief came right out with a strong statement that said, no, the DA is absolutely prosecuting protesters.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schmidt. Noel?
Thank you. Measure 110 was recently rolled back by the Oregon legislature. It was replaced with an ambitious new system that recriminalizes possession of hard drugs, but also encourages drug users to get into treatment to avoid jail time. What steps should the Multnomah County DA take to ensure this revamped system is a success? Mr. Vasquez?
Again, this is another point where you need to have a DA that you can trust, that has experience in delivering. When we look at this issue, when we talk about trust, Mike Schmidt was the cheerleader for Measure 110 decriminalization. He was out front on that issue. I clearly saw that that was wrong and not good for our community. However, he continued to push that forward year after year and literally flip-flopped at the last minute when our community came forward with massive polls saying, hey, we need to do something better. And what we saw, in fact, was that he took $30,000 from the Drug Policy Alliance just a few days ago. How can we have trust that he will deliver? I will rebuild diversion courts. I will help build the deflection we need and create the support networks to help get individuals into treatment. And finally, and first and foremost, what I will do is I will be the one that will build the teams necessary to crush the cartels, to create a healthy environment so those suffering from substance abuse disorder can feel free to walk in our community without having someone trying to hand them fentanyl all the time.
Thank you. Mr. Schmidt?
Yeah, well, it's good that Mr. Vasquez supports the law change that I help legislators write and to fix Measure 110. Look, what we saw, I supported Measure 110 like 75% of Multnomah County voters. I think a lot of us have seen people struggle with addiction, how hard that is. And we also know that what people who are addicted need is access to health care and treatment. So like 75% of the community, I voted for that. But what we saw was it wasn't working. We saw open drug use on our streets, and we saw that the treatment resources that we needed weren't coming online fast enough. So that's when I got to work. I put out a proposal last summer working with legislators, and then in the short session we rolled up our sleeves and we developed this continuum in 4002, which starts with deflection and gives police officers a new tool where they can actually come up to someone and say, hey, you're not allowed to possess drugs, but if you want, instead of going to jail and prosecution, you can go to treatment. I think that's going to have a major impact, and right now we're spending all of our time getting ready to set up that deflection program on September 1st.
Thank you. And a quick follow-up. What would you do if there aren't adequate treatment options in place? Would you consider charging and possibly jailing someone for minor drug possession?
I will always first and foremost push to see individuals into treatment, and that will be my first approach always. If there's times where someone needs to be sobered up in a treatment readiness storm, which I will help develop with the sheriff, that would be an option, but it would be a very short and then a transition into outpatient treatment options.
Mr. Schmidt?
Jailing people with no options for treatment doesn't make sense. It's not going to help the addiction problem. We need to use that leverage to help people choose to go into treatment, like we do in our specialty courts and different drug courts that we've started since I've been the district attorney.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to continue with treatment here. The next question, do you support mandatory drug treatment for people convicted of committing crimes? And if so, to what extent? Mr. Schmidt.
Short answer is yes, and we do this already. When people are convicted of committing crimes, frequently, if drugs are a part of the issue that drove them to commit those crimes, you'll see part of their sentencing package will be negotiated treatment. It can be in a specialty court. It can be in our MCJRP program, our Multnomah County Justice Reinvestment Program, but frequently treatment is a part of that. The wraparound specialty courts do a fantastic job. They are evidence-based. They are research tested. We know that they work. Recidivism rates are lower for people that go through treatment courts than they go through the traditional system. So investing in those are crucial to our community's recovery. But mandating that people people do treatment when their addiction has led to them committing crimes in our community is absolutely something I support.
Thank you. Mr. Vasquez, same question about supporting mandatory drug treatment for convicted criminals.
The short answer is yes, and I'm someone that actually delivers that. I want to tell you about a story in 2019. I prosecuted an individual by the name of Marcus Gunther for doing graffiti crimes. He came forward and told me that he also had a substance abuse issue. I did help ensure that he went to prison. However, I made sure that he got treatment while in prison and had a full probationary package on the back end so that he would have the support when he got out of prison. I'm proud to say that he reached out to me recently and told me how, while he hated me in 2019 for doing that I had saved his life. I had turned it around. He recently bought a home, he got married, and it really is the reason that drives me forward, knowing that I am out there doing the real work to help individuals. And I believe and know that as a district attorney, this is what I will carry forward and deliver to our community.
All right, thank you, Mr. Vasquez.
You've both been on the streets of downtown Portland and seen the extent of the drug problem. If elected, what specific steps would you take as DA to make downtown safer immediately? Mr. Vasquez, could you start us off, please?
Well, I'm glad to see that recently the elected DA came out and started actually going out with officers to look on the street and see what has been happening so brutally since the passage of Measure 110 that he championed. For me, it will be absolutely about a twofold approach. It will be bringing back accountability, because we need compassionate accountability in our community. We got away, sadly, from actually doing misdemeanors. That was the pledge of Mike Schmidt when he ran in 2020, was to stop doing as many misdemeanors as possible and to stop prosecuting minor felony crimes. And it's led to a situation where it feels like no rules Portland. I will rebuild community courts. I will create the accountability that this community wants in a compassionate manner. And above all, my approach is going to be to create 3 specific teams to crush the cartels that are delivering deadly poison on our streets every day right now, that the everyday person can go out and see happening and has been seeing happen for the last 4 years.
Thank you. Mr. Schmidt?
Yeah, well, Mr. Vasquez can't help himself but to lie about things. There's never been a policy to stop prosecuting misdemeanors or low-level felonies. That's just part of the misinformation that he and a bunch of his backers are pushing. And you can look at the numbers. Our felony and misdemeanor prosecution rates are as high as they've been in the last 7 and 8 years. So with that aside, you don't have to ask what I would do. You can ask what I have done. I was on the governor's task force that was tasked with revitalizing downtown Portland, focusing on bringing it back. I fought for resources to get an access attorney in Old Town. So we have what we brought back was the old neighborhood attorney program. We call it our access attorney program, but now I have one assigned to Old Town to work specifically with those communities and businesses. We've developed cases out of that. I went down to Salem and I fought for $400,000 to help fund Clean and Safe, because we know that our Portland police resources have been stretched very thin, but we still need those eyes on the streets. And so getting that additional $400,000 for Clean and Safe was an absolutely crucial thing that we can do. I'll continue to fight for Old Town. I've been walking around downtown since I became the district attorney, and nothing's new about that. But I'm also focused on the entire community in the entire Multnomah County, not just downtown.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, I appreciate you keeping your answers to time so far. That allows us to cover as much ground as possible here. Next question, we're going to move on to the topic of homelessness here. If Portland enacts a camping ban that is constitutional, would you prosecute people who violate that ban up to and including jail time? And would it be a priority for your office? Mr. Schmidt.
Yeah, if we can get a constitutional camping ban, we would prosecute those cases. Jail would be a last resort. I think our goal would be to help connect people to treatment and resources. We know that the answer for people who are houseless is to get them into housing. Jail is a very expensive housing option, and it's not very good at long-term success. So my goal with prosecution would be to get them connected. I've partnered now locally. We have 8 different community-based organizations we're working on our MOU, our Memorandum of Understanding right now, to set up a program like what we've seen in other cities across the country. We went down to San Diego to visit what they've done. They've had it for 2 decades, and what they have is service providers who are working with people who want to do the work. They're engaging in treatment, mental health treatment, addiction treatment, whatever they need. And if they're putting in the work, then the treatment or the organization writes the district attorney a letter and says, we need you to help this person reduce the barriers that they're facing. Because frequently things that keep people out of housing are old convictions on their records, or maybe even a low-level misdemeanor that they're facing currently. So if they're doing the hard work, we need to meet them where they're at and help them get into housing and reduce those barriers.
Thank you, Mr. Vasquez. Same question, 60 seconds.
And this is one where the devil's in the details. Again, what you hear from Mike Schmidt are ways to dismiss more cases. And really, when he talks about things like his issuance rates in the last question, what he left out was that the actual number of cases that we as a district attorney's office prosecute has wildly went down, cut by half in some cases. So what we're really looking at here is when we want to answer this question about would I prosecute individuals if this law was constitutional? The answer is yes. I'm the one that actually is out there involved, working with the community. I'm the one that actually wrote the MAPS program where it put DAs out there to work in the community. I'm the one that helps connect our community members specifically in ways in which we can look at how do we transition folks from being in custody to housing. In particular, I've worked with a service coordination team for years, and this is a great program that pairs up individuals struggling with homelessness, and it gets them into the resources and the treatment they need. It's been my practice for over 20 years to be involved in this, and I will always continue to be in that vein.
I just want to clarify very briefly here, you would prosecute cases up to and including jail time?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Vasquez. We're going to get to our first viewer question now. It comes from Lucia Longoria in the Montavilla neighborhood. Take a look.
Hi, I'm Lucia, and I'm interested to know what you've done to reduce racial disparities in the criminal justice system and who you've worked with collaboratively to get to these outcomes, keeping prevention in mind. Thank you.
All right. Our thanks to Lucia for that. Mr. Vasquez.
Okay. For years, I have worked with the Community Peace Collaborative in the North Portland neighborhood. That was an amazing program, and it was one in which it brought together members from the community. It was run for years by just a fantastic individual, Antoinette Edwards, and it was one that I specifically took that to heart, and I went out to the Rockwood community, and I built my own program called the Renew program. It was one, again, that brought together the community, law enforcement, and the district attorney's office. And through that all, I put together the MAPS program. Of course, it is designed to look at how we engage the community with the criminal justice system. And first and foremost, and where I would end is to say that, I have built and put together the Strategic Prosecution Unit. It uses data and it can carefully monitor how we proceed. Sadly, in the last 4 years, we have seen no real improvement in this area. But under my leadership with strategic prosecution, what we'll be able to do is carefully monitor real time how we're having an impact and disproportionately impacting minorities and make changes. And I always want to point out, one of the key areas is that victims currently are being disproportionately impacted, and we need to bring down that crime rate.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Vasquez. By the MAP program, I just want to clarify our viewers, that's the Multnomah County Attorney Access Program, also known as Neighborhood Prosecutors, I believe 4 prosecutors in neighborhoods across the city. Mr. Schmidt, same question. It's about reducing racial disparities.
Yeah, well, it's nice to hear my opponent taking credit for the program I asked him and others to collaborate on building. But that's what a team is, right? Some of us have to put together the nuts and bolts, and so I'm glad and very proud of that MAPS program. But what you heard my opponent say is how he would prosecute more people to reduce racial disparities. That's a strategy I don't think has ever worked. He talks about strategic prosecution, his strategic prosecution approach, nothing about racial disparity. So again, he doesn't have any answers. He avoids the questions. For me, you don't have to ask what I would do. First thing I did was build a Justice Integrity Unit. The Justice Integrity Unit looks at people's records specifically. We went from processing 1,500 expungement applications a year to almost 11,000 a year for the last couple years. That's helping people get their records clear. That means that they can go on and get jobs and housing and be productive members and get the things that they need to support their family. We also created the Step Court. Step Court targets 2 different crimes in Multnomah County, assault and robbery, where young black men specifically have been over-incarcerated in this community for a long time. We've got a good group of people in there, over a dozen graduations at this point, and we're reducing criminal disparity in our criminal justice system. That's
time. Mr. Vasquez, just very, very briefly here, I'm curious to know if you think you can address concerns like Lucia's while also upping prosecutions, or as some may put it, cracking down on crime. Can you do both? Just very briefly.
Well, yes, to be clear, with strategic prosecution, you can actually use the data to monitor where we're having an impact and make adjustments as necessary. So it's actually a more forward-thinking approach, and it uses real-time data that doesn't wait for downstream. It actually, we can make corrections on the go, and that's why it's so important to implement now.
All right, thank you for that.
While Portland police statistics show homicides and overall shootings declined last year compared to the previous year, they're still well above their 2019 levels. What is your plan as DA to reduce gun violence, specifically in East County neighborhoods that often feel overlooked? Mr. Schmidt?
Yes. So gun violence has been a tragedy in our community. It's way too high. It's positive that it's coming down, as is violent crime across the board, but there's a lot more work to do. Specifically in East County, I've been a champion of getting resources out to youth. We see a lot of the gun violence involving youth individuals. And so I've supported programs like the flag football, the NFL flag football program, giving kids pro-social activities to do out there, especially in our East County. But also what we've done internally in the office as prosecutors, we prosecute cases. That's what we do. I've reorganized our office to have the first ever homicide unit. So I have experienced prosecutors that are working specifically on those cases so they can give them their most attention and work with victims closely to make sure that they're up to date on what's going on in the investigations. But I know that we have to get in front of gun violence. That's reactive. And so I've partnered with OHSU, and we're studying gun violence for the first time in Multnomah County's history with doctors, epidemiologists, teachers, religious leaders, people from across the spectrum, so that they can help advise us on what policies we should adopt to reduce gun violence before it happens.
Thank you. Mr. Vasquez?
Yeah, let's be very clear. The past 4 years have been very rough. We've seen record homicides, as much as over 100 homicides in our community. Back when I was prosecuting cases, I saw that there would only be 20 a year, but I have been there. I'm the only one before you that has actually prosecuted a murder case. In fact, I've done dozens upon dozens. And sadly, this year alone, we're in a situation where right now, as we sit here today, this year per date, we have more homicides than Seattle and San Francisco combined. That's a terrible place to be. And I'm the only DA with the experience necessary to actually make some changes here. And what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to sit down with a mother who has lost their child. And I'm not going to tell them, don't worry, Mike's got a study coming out in a while, and maybe that will change things. I'm the one that's going to get in there and make changes now, because our families, our community deserves this right now. It happens at the street level, working with officers, making sure that we're prosecuting the felons that are in possession of firearms that sadly, right now, are being released back on the street too often. It's about working with the U.S. Attorney's Office. It's about bringing back those community groups I mentioned, which went away under the elected DA and there's been no impetus to bring back. I will bring those back.
And that is time there.
There's a perception in Portland that the small stuff often isn't investigated or prosecuted, a perception that it's not just police or the DA's office, but rather a failure of a whole system. Examples include prolific graffiti, repeat vandalism like broken windows, and even something as small as expired tags or no license plates. As DA, what would your approach be to enforcing what some would call the small stuff? And how would you work with police and community groups to address them? Mr. Vasquez?
This is where the small stuff matters. When I talked about that before, it's very easy to see if you go back and look at Mike Schmidt's major reform promises in 2020. It was to stop doing this very thing. And it's led us to a place where it feels like we're in no rules Portland. And it's sad that we have a situation where, I speak to business owners regularly and they have their windows. It's not like, hey, have you had your window smashed out? They say, my window's been smashed out 9 times. And they just aren't seeing anything from the system. In fact, we've gotten to a place where many folks feel like the things that I reported 5 years ago wouldn't even bother picking up the phone now. It's because it's become so everyday. Under my leadership, of course, I'm going to go out to every precinct, to every roll call, and I will talk to those officers and say, guess what? We have an opportunity. We can be partners again. The partnership that Mike Schmidt broke, we can rebuild. We can deliver the justice this community needs.
Thank you. Mr. Schmidt?
So to actually answer your question, Noel, there's a whole lot of reasons why misdemeanors have gone down in our community. Obviously, the Portland Police Bureau, they wound down their traffic unit. That's why we saw traffic crimes go down. being referred and enforced. When you talk about tags in our community, I think I, like everyone else, was seeing cars driving around without a license plate. And you're like, what is happening right now? Well, no traffic unit will do that. Whether it's shoplifting and theft happening in our businesses that have really damaged a lot of our business community. We saw major shifts in policy, especially at big box stores, to no longer detain people and just let them go out the store. Now, they're making those decisions for liability reasons, but that makes the job of the police to actually get somebody and arrest them for those crimes incredibly challenging. Misdemeanor PCS went away underneath Measure 110. So it wasn't even a crime anymore. So that's why the numbers are down. We've been working with Portland Police. We put together the Organized Retail Theft Task Force. My deputy DA, who's in charge of that, Teresa Turner, has now trained over 375 loss prevention officers around our community. The stores are connected to us, and if they can't get their cases through traditional routes with the Portland Police Bureau, they can call Teresa and we'll make it happen.
And that is time.
Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, I want to talk about the fentanyl crisis right now. Both KGW and The Oregonian have reported on teenagers in our communities who have died from unintentional fentanyl overdoses. In most cases, the victims thought they were taking another drug that turned out to be a counterfeit pill laced with fentanyl. That leads us to this viewer question from Mike Downing in Northeast Portland.
When an adult is convicted of the crime of selling fentanyl to a minor that resulted in their death, what do you think the appropriate penalty should be?
All right, our thanks to Mike there. I want to add to his question, what role should the Multnomah County DA play in preventing similar tragic deaths in the future? Mr. Schmidt.
Yeah, well, prevention is key. As we know, fentanyl has been absolutely devastating in our community. We've had way too many overdoses, and tragically, young people getting it and getting into the fentanyl has been awful. We know we don't have enough treatment. Traditionally, Oregon's ranked something like 49th in the country. Those resources that have come online from Measure 110 are a game changer for us. They need to continue getting investment. When we went down and got 4002 to fix Measure 110, we got an additional $25 million investment in Multnomah County for a drop-off site. That's going to help people hopefully avoid those overdoses. We're getting more Narcan and naloxone out to everybody. I carry some in my bag to make sure that people don't die. So we need to do the prevention side. On the prosecution side, we prosecute those cases. The appropriate penalty depends on a lot of different circumstances that come up. When somebody dies, we have charged somebody with manslaughter for delivering drugs that ended up in somebody's death. So that can happen, but also we look at who the dealers are, what the circumstances are, what people knew at the time. All of that goes into what the relevant penalties should be, and we also work with the U.S. Attorney's Office on those cases.
That is time. I believe the first case that was charged in Multnomah County, separate from federal, obviously, was this year in February 2024. I think that's what you're alluding to there. Mr. Vasquez here, it's a two-parter, appropriate penalties, and what is the role of the DA in preventing similar tragic deaths?
The appropriate penalty is prison. Anyone that's dealing poison to our children should and will go to prison. That is an absolute. Now, I'm glad that I received this recently. This is a flyer from Mr. Schmidt that says now he knows that fentanyl has changed everything. I cannot believe that we are here in 2024 and just now he's figured this out. This is not a mystery. In 2022, we had 500 people die from fentanyl overdose in Multnomah County. In 2023, we had over 600 people die. Why is it just now that we're starting to realize that from our elected DA? This has been a crisis for a long time. And absolutely, when Measure 110 was passed, fentanyl was here in the United States. It was coming. As someone that was involved in the system, through the years, I've seen many drugs come and go. And it was no shock to me when this came up. And it should have been no shock to him. We need to have a very dedicated approach, building the teams necessary to attack this at all levels, as I have very clearly said multiple times, and that is what I am dedicated to bringing to this community.
Mr. Schmidt, I'll get to you in just one second. Mr. Vasquez, just to draw you out very briefly, what does that look like, building the teams at all levels? What are the specifics here?
So the specifics are, on the street level, I have a track history of working with officers, pairing them with DAs on the street level to actually go after drug dealers. Sadly, under the DA, we've seen as little as 7 drug dealers go to prison during his time in a single year. Also, then it happens when we have a team that goes after these drug overdose deaths. It's not like we only had one. We know that there were many, and we should be prosecuting as many of those as possible. So that'll be the second team. The third team will work with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and we'll have those two teams funneling up so that we can attack the drugs that are coming into our community, and then also attack the money that's being funneled out of this community.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vasquez. Mr. Schmidt, I'm going to give you time to respond here.
Yeah, so obviously fentanyl hit our community incredibly hard. It hit the entire West Coast. Mr. Vasquez wants you to think that this is a Portland-specific problem. The overdose rates actually went up more starkly in Washington and California around the same time. So we all got hit with fentanyl at the same place. None of it has to do with my policies or anything else. Mr. Vasquez wants to put together teams. He wants to go back to the war on drugs. That was the whole plan. How has that worked? It's never worked. And I don't know where he'd get the resources to do the things that he's talking about. He doesn't have the support of the county commissioners and hasn't shown that he's had ability to build relationships with elected officials who he's going to need to get the resources he's talking about. So I don't think he has the ability to pull off what he's saying.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schmidt.
Excuses and more excuses.
Do you think our current system adequately handles cases involving defendants with severe mental illness? And if not, what do you think needs to change? Mr. Vasquez?
Unfortunately, the answer is no. This is not a new problem, and it's certainly not one that we've seen any positive movement in the past 4 years. We sadly, and I don't put this all on Mike Schmidt, we have divested from our mental health treatment for years and years, and it's one in which sadly our civil commitment procedures are not up to par. We need to make better changes. We need to be working with individuals in mental health. I'm proud to say that my unit, we work very closely with the mental health court. We put individuals in and we work hard to help give them the support they need. But this is an area that is one in which we need to see a lot of change, and we need an advocate who believes in this area. My wife, who is going to get her master's in counseling and therapy, this is near and dear to my heart, and it'll be something that I will be advocating for greater growth in this area to help support this community.
Mr. Vasquez, could you be more specific?
Certainly. The areas that we need to improve is absolutely in the dual diagnosis. So dual diagnosis is when someone is suffering from substance abuse disorder and mental health. We need greater treatment resources there. We need some changes to our civil commitment laws, because right now, unfortunately, families that are dealing with an individual that is in crisis, they have no ability to get that person held to get into a healthy place. So those are some very specific areas where we need changes.
Thank you. Mr. Schmidt?
I don't know that that's very specific to say we need dual diagnosis. I don't even know what that means. Look, we have underinvested in this state for a long time. We're right now underneath a federal order that people have to come out of the hospital after a certain amount of time based on the crime that they are accused of, not based on whether or not they are treated and are ready to come back into our community fit to proceed and move forward with their cases. This is a huge issue, and they're doing that because constitutionally there are people waiting in our jails, and our jails are backlogged with people waiting to get into the state hospital. I have some amazing prosecutors on my team, senior deputy DAs who are working on this with the Oregon District Attorneys Association to look at all of our laws. But just saying that civil commitment laws need to be changed and made easier to get people civilly committed ignores the very real realities that there aren't places for people to go. We need local places in each of our communities that people can go to, secure residential treatment facilities that people, when they do get out of the hospital but they're not yet fit to stand trial or to have their cases proceed, they can still, in a secure setting in our community, get the treatment that they need. We don't have enough resources, and this is something the legislature and the governor need to fix.
Very briefly, because I just want to draw you out on this, Mr. Schmidt, do you favor lowering Oregon's high standards for civil commitments?
At this point, we can't. There is no place for people to go.
All right, so that's a no. Mr. Vasquez?
Yes, I do, and I also favor encouraging more resources for this area as well.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. We're going to move on to talk about the public defender crisis. Very familiar to both of you, I'm sure. By some measures, the crisis over our lack of public defenders has never been worse in Multnomah County. Beyond calling on the state to take further action, what specific steps can you take as DA to address this crisis? Mr. Schmidt.
So what we've done over the last year, obviously I've worked in the bipartisan legislative task force that's looked at this issue. There are things that need to be done on the policy level, looking at caseloads, making sure that those are the right way. The contract authority is held by the Office of Public Defense Services, and they can look at how many cases are had. That needs to be examined. What I've done as the district attorney is looked at early resolution of cases. When people aren't getting an attorney appointed to them, those cases are ending up being dismissed ultimately. So we've brought in a kind of intermediary step where there's an attorney specifically that can work with people where those cases might be dismissed, and they can meet with that attorney and decide whether or not they'd like to resolve it sooner. That way we're not just adding to more and more cases being dismissed. But look, at the end of the day, we have to recognize when those cases are dismissed, victims are not receiving justice, and that is delayed and denied. So I'm also working on behalf of victims to hold people accountable. When those cases are dismissed, we're bringing them back. So we're not giving up, but it's a real problem for our community for what we can do.
Thank you. Mr. Vasquez.
Sadly, this is not a brand new issue. This occurred about 3 years ago when they changed the contracts around public defenders. And what we lost out of that was accountability and transparency. I have a very clear plan for how to help navigate us out of this. First, there's a short term, because one area we'll agree is that victims are not being served right now. We have at least probably 1,000 cases sitting in our office right now that aren't going forward. And that's 1,000 victims that aren't getting justice. In the short term, I absolutely will fight and try to bring forth civil attorneys, people with prior criminal law experience, to come forward and help out with this crisis. Yes, that was tried briefly before, but I'm one that believes that if you hit a hurdle and it doesn't work the first time, that doesn't mean you give up. You keep fighting for this community. You keep fighting for victims. I have an intermediate plan which calls for actually bringing forth legislation to bring transparency and accountability to those public defense firms, and long term is getting us on track to create a state-run public defense service.
Mr. Vasquez, I believe you're referring to a letter from the former Chief Justice of the Oregon Supreme Court who tried to get bar members to sign on to this idea. There was pushback from lawyers worried it could compromise the rights of defendants if they're not experts in public defense, and others who said it was insulting to public defender profession. What would be different this time? How would you get people on board with your plan there?
I'm not understanding the insulting to public defender profession. These are individuals that actually would have real experience. It's not shocking at all. In fact, I could sit here and name off 10 to 15 attorneys right now that have prior criminal law experience that could handle these. And it's a situation where, yeah, there's always going to be a hurdle, but that doesn't mean you don't work hard and overcome. And that's something that, I'm not passive in how I do this. I'm active. I'm always going to be fighting for victims. I'm always going to be seeking to get over those hurdles, work with the chief criminal judge. Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Vasquez. Mr. Schmidt, is using civil lawyers as public defenders, in your view, a viable solution here?
No.
Why not?
It's not, because it's been tried. And Mr. Vasquez has 15 lawyers. They are welcome to step up anytime and take cases. In fact, if you're listening tonight, please take some cases and help us get more people representation. The fact is they're not interested in that. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Not because they're not good people or anything else, but there's pay and what they're giving up to do that and what the financing of the systems are. So yeah, this has been tried and talked about over and over and over again. It's gone nowhere, and it won't be any different under him.
Thank you.
In recent years, the Multnomah County DA's office has seen turnover and the loss of experienced prosecutors. Broadly speaking, it seems morale is low. What leadership will you bring to address those concerns? Mr. Vasquez, could you start us off?
Well, certainly I bring a wealth of experience, and I will be someone that leads from the front, someone that they can trust. Someone that they can trust won't discriminate against them. First and foremost, I'll end the practice of gender discrimination that has occurred under Mike Schmidt, as there's been at least 3 separate claims and allegations of gender discrimination, more about retaliatory ones. We've lost over 300 years of experience under this DA. It's one where, what we need is an individual that actually mentors and cares for the attorneys, wants to build a training program, which I will do when elected, because it's one that we should have had a long time ago to help build morale, to show them that we support them. And then, of course, you need a leader that the attorneys can trust. And what we have here is very clear. The attorneys in my office, they heard from Mike Schmidt, they heard from me, and they chose to endorse me.
Mr. Schmidt?
Yeah. Well, I think this is incredibly important. When people don't feel safe in their workspace, we need to hear that. We need to listen to them. We need to look at what we can do to improve it. I've asked that question of my office twice now, and we're working on the issues. We've also brought in a equity director to help us move some of these issues forward so we can work on these things. We've brought in trainings, help people on trauma-informed trainings that the entire office is taking. So we're listening to the feedback, and we're trying to make improvements where we can. We now have the most diverse executive team in the history of the agency. 8 women, 5 men are on my executive team that help run the office at every different aspect that it is. When you look at promotional decisions across the agency, they're practically 50-50 in terms of men and women on attorneys. They're more on the administrative side, more favoring to the women, because there are more women employees on the admin side. We put a big emphasis on diversity and hiring, and then recruiting and retaining diverse employees. So we're more diverse than the community that we serve. We're more diverse than the Oregon State Bar. So those are all initiatives that we're working on. It's been challenging these past few years. There's no doubt about that, but that's hit everybody at the same time.
Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, recently at KGW, we launched an initiative called the KGW Solutions Project. So in that vein, I want to ask you this. We've touched on it briefly. What is one program you have championed in recent years that you think has made a positive impact in Multnomah County, and why? Mr. Schmidt.
Yeah, I think probably the one, there's been several, many actually, but the one that jumps out to me is our Justice Integrity Unit. Being able to go through and help people get their records clear. I go into the courtroom with the Justice Integrity attorneys on Fridays when I can attend, and I get to see people stand up in front of a judge and find out that they're no longer a felon, that they can suddenly get into housing, they can get a job. They've done the hard work, they've paid their time, but now we're helping them get their records cleared so that they can move on and get employment and everything else. To see kids and families and mothers and fathers to be there with them and see the tears go down their face is a pretty moving thing. And now that we've impacted over 22,000 Multnomah County residents over the last couple years, I can say that's probably the program that has had the greatest impact on Multnomah County residents. There are other programs we've built, like our STEP court, that is keeping families together in our community instead of sending them to prison and decreasing disparity. Our neighborhood, our MAPS attorney program, where we have deputy DAs in the neighborhood. I get to go with them and see people in the community, hear from their challenges. So I think there's a lot of good positive programs coming online. And
that's time. For context for our viewers, the STEP Court is a phased program for people convicted of some assault and robbery charges with substance use or behavioral issues underlying the crime there. Mr. Vasquez, same question.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that DA Schmidt recognizes how valuable my program was to create the MAPS system. You know, this is one that really actually serves the entire community. When I originally put this forward, I wrote the program actually for 8 attorneys. And, you know, unfortunately, the county commissioners only funded 2. But I'm never one to be satisfied with that. And so I went and I spoke with Gresham Police, and I spoke with the city of Portland, and together they came up and funded a 3rd one. I was very proud to see that come online. And then the county commissioners saw how great that was working, so they added a 4th. And it's one that I will continue to build on, because that program, what it does is it first and foremost, it does connect people to the courthouse, to the justice system. It makes it more accessible, particularly for communities of color. And it also is the one, I had an example recently where the Old Town deputy explained to me she did amazing work helping an individual get an expungement that changed his life, allowed him to get into housing, really had an impact. And it's one that has impacts throughout the entire county, and I'm so proud to say that, that I helped create that.
Can you commit to increasing the number of prosecutors on the ground? Right now I think we're about 4, so what would your goal be?
The goal is 8, for sure, and that's where I'm going to continue to push. And it's one that, as we build on the success of it, we will continue to increase it, and I will continue to push the county commissioners to fund more.
Mr. Schmidt, just briefly here.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that Nathan Vasquez got this program started is ridiculous. The neighborhood district attorney program went away with budget cuts. When I got into office, there was no such program. I went to our attorneys and said, hey, this is what we need to do. Can you write up a proposal? He came up with the acronym, so he gets credit for that. But the nuts and bolts have been done by, it's a team effort.
All right, if you could just finish your sentence, I want to move on to some other questions here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the role of the district attorney. What do you see as the role of the DA? Is it to advocate for statewide changes to the criminal justice system, or is it the bread and butter work of prosecuting people for crimes committed in the community? Mr. Vasquez.
The way that I like to describe this particular one is that, the district attorney is the hub at the wheel of justice. And from that, there are many different spokes. There are victims, there's law enforcement, there are community members, there's the Department of Community Justice, there's a court system. The role of the DA, in my mind, is always to be at that center point, being active, pushing forward, making sure that we are all moving in the right direction. It's sadly one where we've seen broken relationships that have characterized the last 4 years. We've seen victims not valued. We've seen issues where, there are victim groups that have been really hurt by the actions of the DA. There was a situation where we saw record homicides, and at the same time, Mike Schmidt supported 12 murderers being released by the governor under her commutations. And I think that really hurt us. And so I'm about bringing back that central hub, being active in bringing back compassionate accountability and really helping this community get back to a healthy place it needs to be.
So it sounds like you're saying, Mr. Vasquez, that you believe it is the bread and butter work of prosecuting crimes in the community. You see that as the role of the DA.
That's why we are prosecutors.
Mr. Schmidt?
Yeah, well, I see it differently. When I took over in 2020, we had 72 prosecutors. We had seen our budget absolutely stagnate over the last 15 years. In my first 4 years, now we're up to almost 100 prosecutors. Our budget has increased by $15 million. I'm actually in budget cycle right now as we speak, advocating for more resources for our agency. We've been able to build back the district attorney's office to where it was and should have been before I got started. So part of it is running the office. In fact, also this week, we're implementing a brand new case management system, which I know doesn't sound sexy, but that's the actual work of running a 260-person law firm. But also, there's the advocacy side, to be present in the community. And I spend a lot of time in community spaces. As you know, Noel, I go out and I visit a lot of people and have meetings across the community. It's not just sitting in the office. There are attorneys that do the trial work. They're fantastic at what they do. But the job of the DA is to be there to listen to people. And then I work in the legislature. I'm very involved and very active in the legislature and bringing the ideas, a lot of times, that come from the deputy DAs to help make our criminal justice system better.
I wonder if you could each talk about what your biggest professional failure or regret has been in the last 4 years and what you would do differently. Mr. Schmidt?
Yeah, I think one of the things for me that's been really challenging is when I got started, obviously it was a lot of different things going on, pandemic and everything else. But I didn't get to working on our victim advocate program as fast as I would have liked to. And it was brought to the forefront by a victim advocate who left our agency. And she wrote a letter and saying that she felt like the advocate program had not been taken care of. I took that to heart. I didn't agree with everything she said in the letter, but I really took her meaning. We got some outside consultants to come in and look at the program, give us recommendations. We've now since then been following the recommendations, making structural changes. We're adding resources. In fact, in my most recent budget, we're adding 2 more positions to that advocate program. So I'm actually very excited about what we've done with the advocate program now, but it took me longer than it should have to get to that program. And so I'm glad that we can make up for it now, but that's something that could have been handled better.
Thank you. Mr. Vasquez?
I look back and I really wish I could have done more to support the young attorneys in the office. It's one where we saw them just leaving at record rates. And yes, I mentored them. Yes, I tried to bring them on cases and help them. But they were so disenfranchised by what they were seeing from their elected leader that really, with the gender discrimination and that, it was something that, I felt like I took to heart. And it really struck me that we as an office were not healthy and we were not serving the community. And it's ultimately what pushed me to run was looking out my door and seeing what I was out there on the streets, how our community was suffering, how the attorneys in my office were faring. And it was such a terrible situation that I look back and I always ask myself, what more could I have done? Was there more? And it is what pushed me to run because we need a healthy leader.
All right, candidates, thank you for your stamina here. It is time for the lightning round, a chance to catch your breath maybe, but get to some outstanding topics. In this section, unless otherwise specified, we ask you keep your responses to a single sentence at the very most. Appreciate your cooperation with that. Let's begin with some issues here. How many times should a suspect be permitted to fail to appear in court until they are arrested and held until they can go before a judge? My current understanding is that number is 3. Mr. Schmidt.
I don't know that there's a magic number, but if people fail to appear over and over again, they should be held to see a judge.
Mr. Vasquez.
Under me, I'll end that revolving door. They get one failure to appear.
Do you support the changes made to Oregon's cash bail system? Mr. Vasquez.
No, it created a revolving door. I will change that.
Mr. Schmidt.
We needed to change our pretrial system because what we had was unconstitutional.
Do you support mandatory minimum sentences for the most serious crimes? Mr. Schmidt.
No, I don't support mandatory minimum.
Mr. Vasquez.
For crimes like rape and murder, absolutely yes.
Do you think the threat of jail time is an effective tool to get people camping on the streets into shelters? Mr. Vasquez.
That alone is not. We need more.
Mr. Schmidt.
No, it's not an effective tool.
All right. What, in your view, is the key or keys to being an effective and respected leader, Mr. Schmidt?
I think collaboration would be the number one thing.
Mr. Vasquez.
Trust.
How would you describe your relationship with County Chair Jessica Vega Peterson? Mr. Vasquez.
It's good. We've had good conversations.
Mr. Schmidt.
She's endorsed me.
How about your relationship with Portland Police Chief Bob Day? Mr. Schmidt.
Very good. Spent all day with him yesterday.
Mr. Vasquez.
We've worked together for 20 years. I know him well.
How often should an elected DA physically be in the office? Mr. Schmidt.
I think about 60% of the time.
Mr. Vasquez.
90%. You need a leader.
A few more here. What grade would you give yourself in your last 4 years on the job? Yourself, Mr. Vasquez.
I would give myself probably a B+.
Short on time here. Mr. Schmidt.
That's for the voters to decide.
Mr. Schmidt, what grade would you give your opponent?
He's a good trial attorney.
Mr. Vasquez.
Probably an F.
And what is something you admire about your opponent and why? Mr. Vasquez.
You know, he has an amazing, lovely family.
Got to cut you off. Mr. Schmidt.
He's okay.
He's okay. Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Vasquez, thank you both. That wraps up the KGW Oregonian debate in the race for Multnomah County DA. Our thanks again to both the candidates for an engaging, insightful, and respectful conversation. On behalf of Noel Crombie and all of us at KGW News and The Oregonian, I'm David Molko saying thanks for watching, and don't forget to vote.